So I just read a really interesting book. It's called The Social and Psychological Basis of Ideology and System Justification. It came out in 2009. So there are two major theories about the source of ideology. The first is that it comes from a motivation, that the individual is trying to achieve something, and so begins to develop a worldview that aligns with that motivation. The contrasting view is that there is a psychological basis for ideology, that we are not inherently rational creatures, and that we're not always acting deliberately and according to a plan. So I have some reservations about books like this, including Willem Reich's Mass Psychology of Fascism, because they risk defining conservatism tautologically, which is to say, conservatives justify systems because they're conservative. And it seems to be something that might be happening here. So I'm looking into chapter 5 because of the fact that it is the first that I saw that deals with the just world fallacy, or as they call it, belief in a just world. They point to a study to say that the majority of people actually believe in a just world in some form. And there is the motivational argument to say that people need to believe in a just world for one reason or another. So they come to some really interesting conclusions. They say that people who believe in a just world are much less likely to be political, because why would you change anything if everything's fair and just? People who believe in a just world are much less likely to believe that political action is going to be fruitful, or more generally, that political involvement is just going to be ineffective. So they see protest as a waste of time and a needless obstruction. And why would they unionize? So you can begin to see how this is associated with conservatism. So they're going to say, and I quote, although fairness is probably one of the most common legitimizing perceptions, there are likely additional reasons for a system to seem legitimate and justified. So some of these other justifications for the system include tradition, authority, religious doctrine, and perceived equality. And they say that all of these differ based on ideology. To explain further, tradition is used to justify the system by saying that we've done this for a long time, so we should just continue doing it. I would point to the quote, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." A way that you could justify a system through authority would be to say that this person is respectable.
Respect my authority!
They're credible and they're worth following. You might even suggest it's a deferral of responsibility. Another way to justify a system would be to point to a religious doctrine, to say this derives from God. If you can successfully attribute a system to the divine, it is much less likely to be challenged. How are you supposed to go against a system that was set up by God, or is natural, when that is synonymous with perfection? The final ideological means that they give for justifying a system is perceived equality. Even unequal systems can be justified if they appear balanced in some way. This then stems into what they call the compensatory qualities, which just means that they will rationalize disparities. So for example, when people talk about the poor, and they say, they may be poor, but they're rich in happiness. You see the typical fucking imperialist dogma around the world that somebody is impoverished through systemic injustice, and it's a matter of, oh, but they're so cultural and they're so happy and they have a better life than us because they're more in touch with nature, or whatever. And then conversely, suggesting that the rich are always unhappy for one reason or another. So the compensatory qualities appear to act like cognitive dissonance, that you're trying to find a balance when you know that there's an inequality. It acts to justify the system by compensating for it in whatever way that you can. So as part of the idea that the world is just, they run a study on discrimination. They find that representation is an essential part of even perceiving discrimination occurring, particularly for people who believe in a just world. The reason for this is that to perceive yourself as a victim of discrimination, it's not just about receiving worse outcomes or being negatively treated, but you need to be aware of the fact that other members of that group have similar experiences. The results of this study are very interesting. Essentially, I would be using this to argue that it's better pragmatically not to believe in a just world because it results in these particular outcomes, that you would have a more consistent perception of discrimination where it actually exists, regardless of whether or not it's affecting you directly, that you would have more solidarity, that there seems to be the greatest amount of perception of this discrimination when it was affecting all of the other people, but not necessarily the individual, and that there was exactly the same amount of false positives, so that both people who believed in a just world and those who did not believe in a just world both saw that there was discrimination happening where it didn't happen in the exact same amounts. So they concluded that people who believe in a just world perceive less discrimination in general, but they have the most intense reaction when it does affect them. The belief in a just world becomes quasi-religious in the sense that it often comes down to a sense of deserving, if not just directly fate, in the sense that the just world is justified by having a perceived deservingness of targets. So they did a series of correlational investigations. So they ran one study where they did a completely random lottery, and they found that people who won that lottery, even though it was completely random and they had nothing to do with it, they didn't have any responsibility over it, they were viewed more favorably, even though it was just pure luck. In another study, looking into this kind of luck, or at least how I read it, they had an actor who was said to have contracted HIV, and they represented them in different ways. So they would represent them as either having some responsibility for the fact that they had contracted HIV, or it was completely outside of their control. They found that people who believe in a just world negatively evaluated the person when it was completely out of their control. However, when they were told that the person had some level of responsibility for contracting HIV, it had no impact on their perception of that person, because it's less confronting to their view that the world is ultimately fair and just, if the person has suffered a negative consequence due to their own actions. The final study that I took note of was about social mobility. So they actually found that there was no direct association between a belief in a just world and a belief in upward mobility. They found that people who were in high status groups were able to perceive the discrimination of other people as a potential reason for why they were not a part of that group. They also discuss what they call attribution, where they give a series of examples. So an elderly person is at fault for their poor finances and their poor health. That poverty is a result of people's poor character and behaviour. And conversely, that wealth is due to internal causes and is ultimately deserved. So no matter what the outcome is, there will be a justification.